L'Incoterm, ou International Commercial Term, est un terme clé du commerce international qui définit les responsabilités respectives des acheteurs et des vendeurs dans le cadre d'une transaction. Ces termes sont établis par la Chambre de commerce internationale, ou CCI, et sont utilisés dans les contrats de vente pour clarifier les obligations de chaque partie ainsi que les modalités de livraison et de transfert de risque. Les Incoterms sont utilisés pour éviter les malentendus et garantir que les conditions de la vente sont bien comprises et acceptées des deux côtés. Ils définissent qui doit payer pourquoi, comme le transport, les assurances et les taxes, qui doit prendre en charge la gestion des risques, à quel moment la propriété du produit est transférée et où la responsabilité change. Voici un aide-mémoire détaillé sur les principaux Incoterms, avec une explication complète de leur signification et de leurs implications pratiques pour les transactions commerciales. EXW ou Ex-Works, en français à l'usine, responsabilité du vendeur. Le vendeur met la marchandise à disposition dans ses locaux, que ce soit une usine, un entrepôt ou autre, prête à être expédiée. Le vendeur ne supporte aucun frais de transport, de douane ou d'assurance après que la marchandise soit retirée du point de départ. Responsabilité de l'acheteur. L'acheteur doit prendre en charge l'ensemble des frais de transport, d'assurance et de douane à partir du point d'origine. L'acheteur assume également tous les risques dès le moment où la marchandise est mise à disposition du vendeur. Avantage, convient lorsque l'acheteur souhaite prendre en charge toute la chaîne logistique. FCA, or Free Carrier, also known as Franco-Transporteur. Under this term, the seller's responsibility is to deliver the goods, cleared for export, to a carrier designated by the buyer at an agreed-upon location. The seller pays for the transport up to the point of delivery and assumes the risks until that moment. From the point of delivery to the carrier, the buyer takes on all costs and risks related to the transport, as well as those associated with importation. The advantage of FCA is that it is more flexible than EXW because the buyer gets to choose their carrier while having the assurance that the seller handles the export clearance. FAS, or free alongside ship, also known as Franco le long du navire. Here, the seller is responsible for delivering the goods alongside a ship designated by the buyer at the agreed-upon port of shipment. The seller bears the transport costs and risks up to this point. From this moment onward, the buyer assumes all costs and risks, including maritime transport, unloading, and import customs duties. The advantage of FAS is that it is particularly convenient for maritime transport, as the buyer manages the main freight after the delivery alongside the ship. FOB, or free on board, also known as Franco à bord. In this scenario, the seller takes on all costs and risks associated with the goods until they are loaded onto the ship at the agreed-upon port of shipment. From the moment the goods are loaded onto the ship, the buyer assumes the costs and risks, including maritime freight, insurance, and import duties. The advantage of FOB is that it is widely used for maritime transport and clearly defines the division of responsibilities at the point of loading. CFR, or cost and freight, known in French as coût et fret. Under CFR, the seller assumes the costs and freight necessary to transport the goods to the port of arrival. However, the risk of loss or damage to the goods is transferred to the buyer once the goods are loaded onto the ship. The buyer is responsible for import fees, unloading costs, and risks after the goods are loaded. The advantage here is that the seller controls the shipment and arranges maritime transport, but the risk of loss is transferred as soon as the goods are on board. CIF stands for Cost, Insurance and Freight, or in French, Coût, Assurance et Fret. In this term, the seller covers the transport costs, freight, and insurance up to the port of destination. The insurance coverage must be minimal according to the Incoterm rules, but it protects the buyer against the risk of damage or loss during transport. The buyer is responsible for risks from the moment the goods arrive at the port of destination, as well as all import and unloading fees. The advantage here is that the buyer benefits from insurance coverage, which is a significant asset for international maritime deliveries. CPT, or carriage paid to, known in French as fret payé jusqu'à the seller, is responsible for all transport costs up to an agreed location in the destination country, including the main transport. However, the risks are transferred when the goods are handed over to the carrier for shipment, even though the seller covers the cost. The advantage of CPT is that it allows the seller to control part of the logistics while minimizing their exposure to risk. CIP, or carriage and insurance paid to, also known as fret et assurance payée jusqu'à. Under this term, the seller pays for the transportation costs as well as the insurance up to an agreed location in the destination country. The buyer, on the other hand, assumes the risks from the moment the goods are handed over to the carrier, but they benefit from the insurance coverage during transit. This offers an additional layer of insurance protection for the buyer, even though the risk is transferred from the beginning of the transport. DAP, or delivered at place, also referred to as rendu au lieu de destination. Here, the seller bears all the costs and risks until the goods are delivered to a specified location in the destination country, ready for unloading. The buyer takes on the costs and risks from the moment the goods are delivered and must handle the unloading and import formalities. The advantage here is that the seller covers most of the logistics, but the buyer has to manage the unloading and importation process. DDP, or delivered duty paid, also known as rendu droits acquittés. Here, the seller takes on all costs and risks related to transportation up to the destination, including import clearance and taxes. The buyer simply takes possession of the goods upon arrival without worrying about customs formalities or import costs. The advantage here is that the seller assumes almost all responsibilities, greatly simplifying the process for the buyer. Let's take a look at a summary table of Incoterms, EXW. The seller's responsibility is to deliver at the factory, while the buyer handles all transportation and risk. FCA. The seller delivers to the carrier, and the buyer takes on transport, insurance, and customs. FAS. The seller delivers along the ship, and the buyer handles transportation and import clearance. FOB. The seller delivers on board the ship, and the buyer takes on maritime transport and risks from the point of embarkation. CFR. The seller handles transport up to the port, while the buyer takes on risks from loading and import clearance. CIF. The seller manages transport and insurance up to the port, and the buyer deals with risks after arrival and import costs, CPT. The seller handles transport up to the destination, and the buyer takes on risks after delivery to the carrier. CIP. The seller manages transport and insurance up to the destination, while the buyer handles risks after delivery to the carrier. DP. The seller takes care of transport up to the destination, and the buyer handles risks after delivery and unloading. DDP. The seller handles complete transport and customs clearance, and the buyer takes on risks after delivery. In conclusion, choosing the appropriate Incoterm is crucial for clarifying the distribution of responsibilities and avoiding disputes. Both the buyer and the seller must ensure they fully understand the implications of each term and negotiate their contract conditions in a way that their respective expectations and obligations are clearly defined. Incoterms are essential for structuring effective and secure commercial transactions, especially in international trade, where managing risks and logistical costs can be quite complex. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe, like, and share.